Hello, this is Alan Green. This is the second part of an ongoing series of interviews with Paul Jason, the motorcycle broker. In our last interview, we looked at several examples of classic motorcycles and the sort of returns investment-grade machines have delivered over the past 10 to 20 years. Today, we take a look at the classic car market and see how some of the iconic cars from the past 70 years have performed as investments. We also ask whether classic motorcycle prices have kept pace with classic cars and whether a valuation gap exists between the two classes. Paul, it's good to speak with you again.
Good morning, Alan. Good to speak to you again.
So before we look in detail at the classic cars, I'm going to pick up where we left off last time with the slide that shows the return on investment on three classic Ducati motorcycles. In particular, the Carl Fogarty Ducati has delivered a pretty impressive return.
Yeah, it's incredible. I've tracked these since about 2010. I've known one or two owners of these machines. There are only four in the world from the 1994 season, which is absolutely iconic. And it went on to tell another great story continuously in World Superbike until about 1999, 2000, around then. And its racing success is legendary. It's the stuff of myths and legends in the same way that Barry Sheene was just prior in the 70s.
My hero.
Yeah. And, you know, Carl Fogarty, he's now a celebrity. He was on Wave One, I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. And more and more people, his profile's being raised, but people always look over their shoulder at World Superbike and Ducati's dominance in it through the 90s. And to be able to get your hands on a machine like that is, there's just very few of them there. They just don't exist. There's lots of fakes, lots of forgeries, lots of claims that people have got them, but they have to be verified. It has to be a verified motorcycle. And we're only dealing with the verified motorcycles here.
Yeah, okay. There is, of course, a great deal of disparity in the sales data from auction houses, auction websites, dealers, and of course private sales. But Blue Blooded Blank Coutts established a passion index some years ago, and they recently published some data on classic car prices in comparison to such classes as wine, art, jewelry, coins, and so on. So this makes really interesting reading because it does, I think, place a benchmark on classic car and classic vehicle performances.
Yeah, I mean, really, since I guess it's the early 2000s. It is the early 2000s. People in Britain and then later in the rest of Europe have been getting into tangible assets, and then that really kicked off from 2007-8 when you had the crash. It really firmed up that this was wise to do because that was when the big money printing began, and you can't make more of a particular classic car. Even if you 3D printed the things, they wouldn't have the correct engine and chassis numbers. So those are unique. And it's the same with all of these things. These watches, they made so many of them. That's it. When they finish making that, you can't go and you're just left in the used market, and they seem to grow in value as time goes on. In the same way art does. There's only so many Picassos. There's only so many paintings that Picasso painted and pieces of artwork that he created. And it's the same for all artists. So an art, people have been investing in it for hundreds of years. It's a very old investment. So there's no real difference between, in principle, between art, coins, classic cars, fine wine, whiskies, watches, and of course, classic motorcycles. It's just that they've been a lot more under the radar, and they're starting to break cover now, and people are turning to them. We are getting so many inquiries from classic car owners and property owners as well, people who have taken their money out of property and are looking for another safe haven. It's safe haven investing with an element of fun.
Yeah, and you made a very good point, of course, after the credit crunch in 2007, people looking for returns on their cash were really struggling to find any sort of return from the banks. And of course, alternative assets like this really came into their own.
Yeah.
So just on this, while we're on these vehicles, let's take a look at some of these wonderful cars and bikes. So of course, we've got here, these, of course, these are your bikes, Paul. So you'll know all about these. Can you just run us through the through the bikes again?
Okay, as you look at the screen, the top left-hand red Ducati is a Series 1 factory replica 996 SP. Britain had its own version called the Foggy Rep, the Carl Fogarty replica. They made 202 of those, but it was only released in Britain, so it's not really a global motorcycle. It's only for people in Britain. But the Series 1 factory replica, they made even less. They made 150 of those, and they were released globally, and they're known about globally. So there's less of them, but there's a much bigger market. So the prices are going to go a lot higher on that 996 SPS factory replica Series 1. In the middle on the top, you've got the Ferrari GTO, the last one that we know that sold off market for $75 million in, I think, 2019 or 2018.
There's an amazing story behind that car. Nick Mason, the drummer of Pink Floyd, of course, bought a 250 GTO in the 70s. And in the 80s, when the two key members of Pink Floyd split, that's David Gilmour and Roger Waters, David Gilmour took Pink Floyd on the road with a huge stadium tour. And the financiers required that tour to be underwritten. So Nick Mason put forward his 250 GTO as security for the tour, and of course, as we now know, it's a fantastic success. But I think that's a lovely story, and of course, Nick Mason is well known for his love of classic cars and his collection.
He's also known for probably knowing something that other people don't, because I remember as a kid hearing stories about when he bought that car. And one of my brother's best friends, his father was kind of like another Harvey Goldsmith. He brought over a lot of bands. He brought over Ike and Tina Turner, Santana. And I remember they were saying he was mad and bonkers for buying that car. £35,000. You could buy a 4 or 5 bedroom house in Wimbledon for that at that time. What's he doing spending it on a car? And 4 or 5 bedroom house in Wimbledon today, probably, what's that worth? 2-3 million?
2.5-3 million, easily, yeah.
And lo and behold, $75 million for his car. I know which I would have rather bought. And he said, just watch me. Apparently, I remember this guy saying, he was like, I don't get it. He's saying, just watch me. He's bought a car when he could buy a house. He's mad. You can't rent a car out. Lo and behold,
he was absolutely on the money with that. He's a great foresight, and of course we've got the Alfa 8C there below the Ferrari.
Yeah, now the Alfa 8C has gone up immensely. They're about $20 million now. And there is a link between that and a particular motorcycle, the MV Agusta 750S. That 8C has gone up from, I think around 2004, £1.5 million to around $20 million today. That's one hell of a return. And I recently did an interview with the author Ian Falloon, which is going to come out soon, where we talk a lot about the Alpha 8C and its links with the MV Agusta 750S, where the MV Agusta 750S is nearly half an 8C motor in a bike. So it's a really, really undervalued machine. And there's a lot of smart money going after these Alpha 8Cs. I think we're going to see a lot more increases in prices in the coming decades, decade or two. You're going to see them really, really move. Upwards.
And of course, also in the slide, we've got the Brough Superior and the Ducati 750 SS green frame.
Yes, the top right-hand one on your frame, the silver and green Ducati, that was a 1 year only model, the 1974 750 SS, known as the green frame. They built 401 of them, and it's an amazing motorcycle. Right now, you're looking at well over 150,000 for one. I have seen unrestored ones go for 300,000 plus. Those bikes were £40,000 in 2010.
Yeah,
that's an incredible upward force on prices, but they haven't even begun to take off yet. There's a lot there. The bottom left-hand slide is a Brough Superior, and it is this is a nice under the radar one, which we'll talk about later. That's an 1150 SS100. It was an 1100cc motor, and it was a side valve, and it was one of the best motorcycles they made. And that's quite an undervalued Brough. But the overhead valve Broughs, the other SS100s with the 1000cc motors, are now fetching 350,000 plus for investment grade ones, and going up. And I know of owners globally who are asking a lot more for them, and they're getting that. So they're heading towards £500,000.
Okay. We've got some more cars and bikes here. Of course, we've got so the the Alpha 8C is still there in the middle. So we talked about that, and of course the green frame and the Brough. But let's just look at we've got the Aston Martin DB4 here, Paul, and the Vincent Black Lightning.
Yeah, I mean, that DB4 is, you just look at it, and I think it's the type of car that Enzo Ferrari wished he'd built.
Every boy's dream.
It is every boy's dream. You've got the 007 connection. And those years of Astons are absolutely glorious. I mean, it oozes something special. And I remember going in one in the 1970s as a boy. A friend of my family had one, and you just got in this car and went, wow, this is special. And then he started the engine and the roar. It just excited me. I was into anything that goes when I was a kid. And I remember very well going in it. I think it was a DD5, and being in the back seat and being absolutely blown away with it. Yeah. And then on the top left slide, you've got a Vincent Black Lightning. These have kicked on hugely, and the Vincents they're one of the few British bikes, because the demographics are changing. A lot of the people that owned British bikes are dying now, so there's less people for them. So Triumph Bonnevilles and Norton Commandos aren't a great investment at all. There's millions of them, and there's less and less people every day. But the Vincents and the Broughs have sat up like the flying truck Bentleys, the supercharged Bentleys of the 1920s and 30s, as standout investments. So, you know, people will always go for the Vincents and Broughs. If you want to invest in British motorcycles, those are the ones to go for, and they will continue to go up. So that Black Lightning is something else, and they're amazing.
There's that famous picture or the poster from, I think it's the 50s. The American rider Rollie Free was pictured naked apart from a swimming cap and a pair of swimming trunks on the Bonneville salt flats. trying to, well, he set a speed record then of 150 miles an hour, which wearing nothing but swimming trunks is probably the bravest thing anyone could ever do, or the stupidest, of course.
Yeah, it depends if you stay on the bike or not. He stayed on the bike, so it's bravest, and
Yes.
come off would have been the stupidest, and a very long, painful death, because it would have ripped his skin off and rubbed salt in the wounds, and he would take a long time to die from septicemia. So, you know, but he stayed on, so he's the hero. And yeah, it's an iconic picture. And you just sort of, I remember as a kid seeing that and going like, what's he doing in his pants? And he just looked and went, well, if I get rid of my clothing, I can get an extra couple of miles an hour. And he lay on the bike as well.
Yeah, he actually had his feet hanging off the back, hanging off over the rear. I mean, but it was one of those posters that captured a generation, and it of course it immortalized the Vincent. And of course, one of the Vincents that was involved in the land speed record attempt sold at Bonhams in 2018, I think, for 800,000, 900,000.
Yeah, I think it was in the 900,000. It's a huge amount of money, and it's a great story, and it tells you something. You know, when people buy into this, they're buying into a story. You become a guardian of history when you own such a vehicle, and it's going to be very interesting when electrification comes in, because it's just going to boost values hugely, because everyone will miss the roar and the sensations of an internal combustion engine. So I think you're going to, you know, there's going to be another huge price hike. And of course, you've got China coming into the market. That's going to be even more demand. And you're going to see these values go up and up and up. The classic car market has taken a breather, but it's had, you know, over 15 years of price increases. Nothing just goes up like that and carries on going up. It does have to plateau, and that's what it's doing.
Sure. Well, of course, the Passion Index provides a general benchmark for growth in value, but within this, there have been some spectacular returns from some of those rare and desirable cars we just looked at, along with the bikes. So I've got here a slide that looks at the percentage returns over the past 15 years. So, of course, we can see the GTO, the Alfa Romeo 8C and 6Cs on the left. These are percentage returns since 2007. And then, of course, we've got the bikes on the right. So can you take us through these, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, these bikes are performing very well.
Yeah, they are.
The cars, I mean, I can't think of very much, unless you really got it right with investing in Apple at the right moment. I can't think of much that would ever give you this kind of return. And there are people who can predict it, because they're heavily ensconced in the market and they know what's going to go up, and they know why. They know how many were built. They know how many people had licenses for these things at that time. They understand the demographic push, and they understand the story, and they understand the reality behind each of these machines. And that's what it's about. And it does look like witchcraft, but it isn't. It's just knowledge. And it's
I think it's rarity, as you say, isn't it? If you look at the Ducati Foggy race bike, up 2,300%, the 750 SS green frame, of course, these are rare bikes. There are only a few of them around. And the Brough, of course, has performed very well as well. But yeah, I think it's the key to all of this is the rarity. So if there's something of which there are only one or two out there, then you know, the message here does seem to be that rarity is the key.
Oh, rarity is definitely the driver, you know, because they made some really great cars and some really great bikes in huge numbers, but they're not overly collectible. You can fall over them everywhere. And it's interesting. The Brough is a very good pointer. It gives you an idea of how things are going to go. but you have to be able to compare other machines to the Brough. And the rarity, I mean, they made more than 10 times as many Broughs as they did Ducati green frames. They made more Brough Superiors and many more Vincents than they did 916 SPs and 996 SPs put together over nearly a decade. So you realize that some of these very, very rare machines are sort of lurking in the wings and ready to break cover and deliver massive profits. And there is a science behind this, and you have to understand it really well. And you then need to understand the machines, because you can be sold a very pretty pile of nuts and bolts that you think looks right, and you will absolutely get skinned, because if it's not right, it's not right. And, you know, and also a lot of people have a problem of these things can become black holes you throw money into. And yeah, they can if they're not set up correctly, and very few people know how to set these things up.
Well, of course, we can see on there the Honda CBX 1000 as well. That's just starting. The valuations are nowhere near, of course, the Black Lightning Foggy Race bikes or the Broughs or the green frames, but they're starting to move forward. I mean, they're up 400% in the past 15 years, which is still a pretty good return by any standards.
Yeah, and you know, the CBX, it's going to go to six figures. They're going to be 100,000, and it wouldn't surprise me if it did it in 5 years. I'm not saying it will do it in 5 years, but what I am saying is that if it did, I wouldn't be at all surprised. And they're very, very difficult to find.
Yeah.
They made I crunched some numbers with some people in the know. They made 24,000 of them, but there's actually about 5,000 investment grade worldwide. Of those, over half of them will need restoring. Now, if somebody gives me a CBX 1000 and says, can you restore it? It'll cost them £30,000, depending on what they bought. That's the minimum that it's going to cost them. So they're hugely undervalued, and those restoration costs are only going to go up. They're very, very expensive to get involved with. You know, and you've had experience with these. People are chucking £1,000 just to getting their carburetors sorted, and they're still not sorted. And you know, we're having to charge £1,500 to sort people's carburetors out if they need stripping down into individual units.
My CBX will be on its way down to you very soon, so yeah, I'm looking forward to the reset and riding it afterwards. It's a glorious bike to ride, and but they're complicated engines, 24 valves, 6 cylinders, 6 carburetors, and if they ain't set up properly, they're horrible to ride.
Yeah, and if they've been neglected, that can cause massive problems with them. If you take the sump off and put an endoscope up there and find out it's been neglected, the cheapest option is to fully rebuild the engine, and it costs £5,000 to do that. That is my cost of rebuilding a CBX engine, and that is the minimum. That's just minimum. So, you know, it can cost me as the engineers that are doing it in wages and parts over £5,000. And that's if it's lucky when you get in there. It can cost me a lot more. And then we have to pay our wages and our bills and rent and rates and everything. So we have to have a margin on that. So it's not been unknown for people to come away with a £10,000 bill to rebuild their motor.
Yeah. So if we move on now, Paul, we've looked at classic bikes and the returns that they've delivered over the past 15 years. Some are hugely impressive, but as we've also seen, some are only just starting to appreciate in value. But even so, if we look at the actual sale prices of the cars, they still dwarf the valuations of the motorcycles. So we can see, of course, the 250 GTO sale price there, the Alpha 8Cs and the Astons in comparison to bikes. So Do you think we're going to see a decade where bike prices start to catch up with classic cars, Paul?
They have to. Yeah. I mean, there's less of a bike than there is of a car. So, but there's often nearly as much work in doing a bike as there is in a car. Spraying a motorcycle is really difficult. It is not like spraying a car. There's more of it to do, but that actually makes it a lot easier to do a big area than it is to do a small area with lots of curves. And trying to spray a motorcycle frame is a nightmare. You've got to get into all the nooks and crannies with an airbrush.
Yeah.
Otherwise you'll have dry patches, and then of course it's going to rot out. So, these machines, I could see them going pro rata when you find out which bike is mimicking which car. I could see them easily making 50-60% of the value of the equivalent car. But there's another angle to it, in that they usually made the cars in greater numbers than the bikes, because the era we're looking at, they built very few of these machines. But cars got a lot more preserved. One, they had less accidents. Two, they just didn't get stolen as much as motorcycles. There was a big industry in motorcycle theft. Yeah. They didn't get raced. They didn't get cut up and made into choppers. And when a car engine blew up, they were usually rebuilt. Whereas with a bike, they would just go and buy another engine out of another bike. And that's the end of that bike. It's not investment grade anymore. So there's, the motorcycles are a lot rarer, and there's actually more and more people pouring into, more and more different investors coming into the market. So it could be that certain bikes pro rata become more expensive than the cars because they're just rarer. Green frames, they made 401. There is a register of them which we have access to, and there's 120 investment grade ones left. So that gives you the burn rate on motorcycles, and some motorcycles burn at a higher rate than others. And you can really see that these are really very, very rare machines. And as they're now becoming desirable as an investment asset, they're going to get snapped up more and more, and they just won't be on the market. And when they do come on, you will have 30, 40 people bidding over one motorcycle, and so the prices will go astronomical. But you can see how undervalued they are.
Well, I think this chart really shows that, doesn't it? Because it shows the relative sale prices compared to, we picked out three cars, admittedly, the Ferrari, the Aston Martin, and the Alfa Romeo. And of course, in terms of pure hard cash, the cars are selling for enormous amounts of money. But really, the upward curve in the bike prices has really happened towards, probably since 2015, 2016 onwards, whereas of course the cars were making progress long before that.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually really been kicking off on the bikes since about 2010.
Yeah.
In very short periods of time, you had bikes doubling in value. But for example, you could buy a mint Ducati 916 SP for £5,000 back then. And you could take your pick, because it was just an old bike, and you would find them where someone had even kept them in their living room, so you pay £6,000 instead. And that's for a motorcycle, that today is worth around £40,000. But it's still massively undervalued. I mean, the 916 SP is like the Ferrari of classic motorcycles, the F40. It's like the Ferrari F40 of classic motorcycles. Now, the highest value one is now about 40,000, and the F40 is well over $1 million. So if it went to 60% of the price of an F40, or even 30%, it would be over 300,000, and yet it's just £40,000. That's really undervalued. There's a lot of headroom in these machines.
There is, and of course, going forward into this decade, we've got a whole group of machines that are potentially set to appreciate. We're going to look at this in a future episode in more detail. And of course, there are a lot of machines out there that are potential dark horse investments. I'm just going to whet your appetite for the next episode now by bringing up one such example. Can you tell us about this bike, Paul?
Yes. Alan Millyard is a motorcycling legend. He has built a motorcycle around a Dodge Viper V10 motorcycle. A Dodge Viper V10 car engine. So it's an 800 brake horsepower motorcycle that he rides regularly. And what he did with this particular motorcycle, he's also, by the way, featured on Henry Cole's The Motorbike Show, and I think he's now doing Shed and Buried as well. So he's featured on television a lot, and he's an incredible man. This Kawasaki, you'll notice it's got 4 exhausts, so it's a 4-cylinder. Well, that machine was made originally by Kawasaki as a 3-cylinder 750, and Alan cut the engine up and he made it a 4-cylinder 1000cc 120 brake horsepower 2-stroke, and it's phenomenal. There's very few of them in the world. He very rarely sells them. If he does, he sells them through us. He very rarely sells them. And those machines, and what he tries to make them look like, is a factory prototype, and it just looks like a standard H2 Kawasaki, and it isn't. It's this 1000cc 4-cylinder, and that is the motorcycle Kawasaki should have built. I've got a road test coming out on it soon, and the guy who bought it, he's an investor, and he said, well, I'll name my price, and it's this. If someone wants to buy it off me, that's the price. If not, I'm really quite happy to keep it. I love it. It's great. And I'm quite happy to keep it. And, you know, those machines, they're going to go into hundreds of thousands of pounds. There's no doubt about it. And
Alan Millyard is amazing. He built his own 6-cylinder 350cc motor from scratch in his workshop. Double overhead camshaft. It's like a mini CBX 1000, and he built this thing and runs it at shows. And you know, this is all just with dead reckoning. There's no computer-aided design or anything else. He's just a genius engineer. But well, next time, Paul, I'd love to talk more on this, but we're running short on time. Next time, Paul and I will be looking at other examples of the Alan Millyard dynasty and some of his other machines, along with other ideas for more dark horse investments. Meanwhile, Paul Jason, the Motorcycle Broker, thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Alan. Nice to see you again. Speak soon.